Good morning, everybody.
Hi there.
I'm Debbie.
I'm Callie.
And we're educators at Project Oceanology. We're here to celebrate Earth Week. We're really excited about stuff to share with you today. We want to start off by calling out all of the teachers and students who are tuning in today. If you're looking for a little extra something to go with our video, the link for our worksheet's right up here, bit.ly/watersheds worksheet. So check that out. We're going to be learning about watersheds. This link here takes you to a really cool website called CT Eco, powered by UConn, and you can look to find out exactly where your home watershed is. So a little more on that.
Very cool. So we want to tell you a little bit about watersheds in general, and we have a really cool model that you can make at home, and we're going to show you an example of one here too. So I want to show you what a watershed looks like, at least one that we're part of. And so this watershed here is showing you the entire Connecticut River watershed. And so what's really cool about this is we've got Long Island Sound down here. We're about here where I'm pointing in Groton, Connecticut now, but one of the things that connects us is actually the waterways, the rivers here. And so the Connecticut River is so large. It goes through all of Connecticut, all of Massachusetts. It's actually the border between Vermont and New Hampshire, and it starts just about up in Canada. And so that means that river is really connecting us. And so when we're thinking about the definition of a watershed, we're thinking about an area of water, or an area of land rather, where water drains or collects. So in this case, you can see the highlighted colors. Water that falls in Vermont and New Hampshire is going to move into these smaller tributaries, collect in the Connecticut River, and then eventually that Connecticut River dumps its water right out here into Long Island Sound. We're actually closer, Debbie, to a smaller watershed here, and we call it the Thames River watershed. And so we have a map to show you of what that looks like. That's a little bit more localized. And so we can give you an idea of what this one looks like.
So in this map, they kind of muted the colors outside of the watershed. So the watershed, Callie, is the land, right? Even though it has the word water in it. It's the land where all the rain will drain to central rivers. So there are a lot of smaller rivers that will drain to the Thames. So let's start down here at the mouth of the river where it meets Long Island Sound. This is the Thames River, and we can follow that up between Groton and New London and Waterford, all the way up, and we'll come until we reach Norwich.
Yep.
So the little arrow right there, and we're seeing it's kind of splitting into two smaller rivers. The Yantic River right here feeds it, as well as the Shetucket River. Now the Shetucket River is fed by all of the other rivers north of there. So the Shetucket takes water from the Quinnebog, and the Quinnebog goes all the way up into Massachusetts. So there are lots of other smaller rivers that bring all of that water down eventually to the Thames River and then eventually to Long Island Sound. So these are the different kinds of the two different watersheds that are closest to Project O, but we encourage you to check out CT Eco and see if you can find out what watershed you live in. So we also have a little model of a watershed that we're going to work on. I'm going to pass the camera off to Callie for a moment.
Okay. All right, so follow us over here. We have this really cool model watershed.
Now this is something that you can do as an experiment at home. All you need is a piece of paper and some magic markers and a little bit of water, a spray bottle. So all you need to do to create your model watershed is to kind of pinch your paper up so it creates sort of a landscape or a watershed. And we've kind of already done this a little bit. And then you take your blue magic marker and you kind of draw along the highest ridges on your paper. We've kind of already done that a little bit for your example, but you can see all you need to do, the more blue marker you put on there, the greater the effect will be. Let's make some predictions about what will happen in this watershed when it rains. Go ahead, post in the comments what you think is going to happen when I make it rain on our watershed. Where do you think the water will go? Based on the contours of our watershed. So you can kind of create some hills and valleys. This part of New England and Connecticut, we don't have as many mountains, but just like we saw in our watershed map, up north of here in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, you can find some climbable mountains. All right, so if you've made your prediction, I'm just going to double check my rain mister, and we are going to make it rain on our watershed.
Ooh, I'm noticing something happening here, Debbie. Oh, Hazel, who's age 6, she was thinking that blue is going to start to spread out. And take a look closely. Hazel, you're right. I see some of that blue starting to move off those peaks and kind of start sliding down to some of the lower parts in our watershed. Here's a good example right here.
So it's going to the lower elevation. So that might tell us a little bit about the land that's in our watershed. It falls on the higher elevation and drains to the lower elevation. So that's what's happening in our watershed all the time. When it rains on a higher mountain or a hill, then the rain will travel down through subsurface groundwater. So the water will go below the ground, and sometimes it'll travel on top of the ground too, especially in places where there are a lot of paved surfaces where it can't get absorbed into the ground.
Yeah, and we can also think about snow melt too, especially this time of year.
It's springtime.
Right.
So up in those mountains or in colder places, as the snow melts, that water has somewhere to go. It's going to drain through the watershed into these basins and eventually to larger rivers that will carry it to Long Island Sound. Now, when it rains on our watershed, it's not just water that travels. I want you to think for a moment and make some predictions about what might be transported by the rain in our watershed. So if it rains on a city, or if it rains on the countryside, what kinds of things might the rainwater carry with it?
All right, yeah, and go ahead and post those in the comments. We're going to give you another view of what this looks like. Okay.
I'm going to work on a second model watershed over here.
Excellent. We're hearing from some teachers that they're using something similar like this in their classrooms already.
Oh, I'm excited to hear that. So your students will be experts on watersheds by the end of this. So, do we have any responses about what might be transported?
Not quite yet, but I'll keep my eye out.
So it might rain on a farm, and the plants that live on the farm will use some of that water. But that's not the only thing that will be transported, right? The water might get into the ground. What if it falls on something like a landfill? What might get transported then?
Ooh, I'm hearing a couple of predictions here. Maybe something like sticks or leaves.
Oh, definitely.
Might get picked up. And then Marissa's thinking maybe dirt or sand might get picked up, and maybe even some chemicals or something that's coming off those farms.
Ooh, for sure. So especially in places where the earth is tilled and loose, that sediment or the dirt can be transported or moved. So if you live in a rural area after a big rainstorm, you've probably seen the roads are kind of covered in a little bit of mud or dirt or sand that gets pushed by that rainwater. So that can get transported. It'll move through the watershed, just like our model showed us. Chemicals too, that can happen, definitely. So what kinds of chemicals might we find in the watershed? Things like fertilizers, right? If we were talking about a farm, or even if you want a nice green lawn, it's Connecticut, we get it. Sometimes the grass is not always as green as we like. So you might put a little True Green down there, or maybe you want your tomatoes really big and you put some Miracle Grow on there. That's okay, but that can also not all be absorbed by the plants in your garden and might be transported by our rainwater. Some other chemicals, there might be some pesticides. Maybe you don't want something coming and eating your squash. So you might put a little pesticide on there to kill the beetles that like to eat your squash. So that is also transported in the watershed. So we have a second model here of a watershed, and you can see the blue lines just as before, but we've added some extra features. So the green here is to represent something like a farm, right? So the farm runoff could be things like fertilizers, or even the nutrients found in manure might run off when it rains. The red in this model is going to represent city centers, places where there are just lots of people living, and there might be some motor oil on the streets, or there might be some maybe some trash transported.
That's great, because we had a few folks write in and talk about perhaps oil coming from cars, so that parking lot connection is a good one. And even pollution that might end up from parking lots or roads too.
Absolutely. So all the trash that is in a parking lot could be transported by the rain in our watershed. We also have a little purple area over here that could represent a factory or some sort of industry here. So we're going to make it rain on our watershed a second time, and you can see very clearly how the runoff or the water transported, the colors transported by our rainwater are entering the watershed. So we can see some farm runoff entering our water over here. We can see some city center runoff, maybe some of that motor oil or plastic trash. And then we can also see chemicals released from factories or waste treatment facilities. So all of those things are going to run off or be transported in our watershed eventually to Long Island Sound. So Long Island Sound is connected to our ocean, so taking care of Long Island Sound, taking care of our watershed will also help protect our world's oceans and our beautiful natural resources here.
Yeah, and so one of the things Debbie mentioned here was that marine debris or that trash that may get transported into our waterways. And so that's what we really wanted to think about. Different kinds of pollution. For example, we have non-point source and point source pollution. And so if we think back to our model here, Debbie, what do you think would be a good representation of something that would be a point source, for example?
Well, if I'm looking at the factory here, I know that's releasing a purple chemical in this case, and I know that that's the source of the chemical. I can point to it. So that's an example of point source pollution.
Right.
But if I'm looking at the city centers, there's some pollution coming from there, and I'm not sure who exactly is releasing that. There are lots of people living in that area. I'm not sure who left their Dunkin' Donuts cup on the road yesterday, but I know I can't point to that person, so we call it non-point source pollution. So if I know exactly where that pollution is coming from, I can call it point source. But if it's sort of a vague general idea, we can't point to it, it's non-point source.
Okay. So what we did was we actually collected some sand from the beach. So we want to show you what that looks like. And we were wondering if we would find any pollution right out here on our beaches along our shorelines here in Groton, Connecticut. And we're working on beach cleanups all this week. So that's kind of trash that we can see easily with our eyes, something on the larger scale. So we might consider that to be macro. For example, Microplastics. I know there's a lot of that on my street. So this is an opportunity for us to take a look a little bit smaller at some of the smaller pieces of trash or plastic that may end up in our beaches and our waterways. And so what we're looking here for are microplastics. So something that's less than 5 millimeters, so something pretty tiny. And so Debbie's showing you some of that sand. We have some sieves, or basically screens, that we're going to use to see if we can shake out some of the sediment and look for some examples of pollution or plastic.
Okay, I'm seeing some natural things in here and some human-made things. So a little periwinkle snail, remember our rocky intertidal exploration. I'm seeing some sea glass. So this is most likely of human source, probably some sort of glass bottle that someone used at some point and it broke. And it can be softened or smoothed by the action of the waves. Now, this is technically marine debris, but it's kind of a harmless type of marine debris because this glass will eventually erode into something that's harmless to animals. It's once it's not sharp, the silicates that are in here are harmless to animals. I'm seeing
Iris
some.
is noticing something bright orange in there, Debbie. Can you take a closer
Eagle
look at
eyes,
that?
Iris. This is a plastic. Right, this is a plastic bead, probably from fishing equipment. It looks like something that you would tie to fishing line so that you can keep track of your line while it's in the water. So this probably was accidentally discarded and washed up and was in the sand. Now, the problem with this is sometimes animals might accidentally consume this plastic. And that's not so good because plastic can't be digested by the animal. It might stay in their stomach for the rest of their life. And if they have lots of plastic in their stomach, there's no room for real food. And that can affect the entire food chain. If they can't get enough food, they might die, or they might be less nutritious for another animal further up the food web. So the predators that eat the animals with plastic in their stomach then get plastic in their own as well. So it can travel up the food web to the top of the food chain, and at the top of the food chain, they'll have the most plastic in their stomach. So there are some other types of plastic that we might find.
Don't we want to show them an example of something
yes.
that has maybe ingested plastic? So we'll come back over here to the board. Take a look at this.
Okay, we found a picture of a zooplankton. If you watched Kyle and Marissa teach us about plankton, you might recognize that this is called a copepod. And the scientists who found this copepod used a special fluorescent dye to highlight the plastic that's in the gut of this copepod. Now remember, this animal is so tiny you need to look at it with a microscope. So that means the plastics it was eating are so tiny. Now, Callie, I don't use any plastics that tiny. How did they get that small?
Great question. And so you might be thinking the same thing. Over time, if plastic is exposed to sunshine, it starts to break down over time. Weathering occurs as well, and so as it goes through that natural sort of freezing and thawing cycle, that plastic deteriorates and breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces.
Now, will it eventually go away? If it gets smaller and smaller?
Well, it just gets tinier and tinier. That's what happens to it.
Oh, so it's going to stay in the ocean forever, but it just won't. It'll just get tinier and tinier and harder to avoid.
Right, and harder to spot if you're working on trying to clean up an area, right?
Right. That's no good. Now, we found some even smaller pieces of plastic. I wonder if Callie can show us.
So in addition to those microplastics, or in that same category, oh boy.
Ooh. Anybody know what these are?
Kind of looks like threads, right?
Yeah, it's like my sewing kit.
So these are, again, being looked at using a microscope. These are tiny little fibers. And so if you wear fleece, for example, that's one source of these fibers. Even certain ropes may contribute to this. And so this is another type of microplastic, just in a different form that we can find.
Yikes.
All right, and so when we're typically looking under a microscope at Project O, what we're usually looking at is plankton. And so we showed you an example of that copepod. And so we collected a sample today using our plankton net, and we want to show you what we found underneath our scope.
So Callie and I went out to the water today, used our plankton net to catch, oh, and there's a little something writhing around right there. I can see it.
I'm going to turn the lights off because I think we'll have
That'll
a better
help our view
for people at home.
Now, I believe that this view has shifted a little bit, Callie, since we first looked at it. Oh, yeah.
Yep.
So what you're seeing on screen right now is a piece of seaweed or algae, and there's a little organism that's attached to it and kind of wiggling around. Uh-oh. Oh, did you see that? Move a little back to our right, Callie. You passed something very interesting.
There we go.
Hold it right there. What is that?
All right, I'm going to trace it in blue. It's kind of a blue color. Not sure if you can see that well from home.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a glare from our projector. I'm going to try to find a
Right
better
here.
angle. There, yeah. Now it looks even more blue.
Is an example of a microfiber. something that we pulled up right in our net today.
So what could be the harm of having these microfibers in our waters?
Slide it over so you can see. So when we're
Oh, Molly is correcting me. That was a hydroid, not algae.
Thanks, Molly.
So you can see there. Now, I think if we were to continue to look around in there, we might find other microfibers.
All right, let's take a look. I'm under the scope. I see some little organisms kind of moving around. Let's see.
Yeah, so if I were a little organism moving around in this plankton sample and I swam into that, oh, hello. If I swam into a microfiber, what might happen to me?
Well, I'm thinking on the small scale, you could get entangled if you're so tiny, right? You could get tangled
Absolutely.
up. And then we already talked about ingestion. So those are the two things that come to mind when I think about these small microplastics.
So if you're a teeny tiny plankton, you might get wrapped or entangled in the microfiber, or that could travel up the food web as well. Hazel reminded us that some of the larger organisms like whales might eat that. Do you see the one with your bare eyes? That was like much bigger?
No, there's another blue one here right on the edge.
Oh yeah, it's a little blurry, but there it is. More microfiber. I don't know, it's blurry from our microscope as well, so I apologize for the picture quality here.
Let me check one more spot.
Now, I saw when we took our plankton sample,
here
I
we
could
go.
see that. Look at the
this
size of
one.
that one. Whew.
I'm going to erase the mark.
It's got lots of different fibers wrapped together. You can see red and blue together in there. So that could be a real problem, and honestly, microfibers are everywhere. They're not just in the ocean, they're in our homes. They've been found in human bodies too. We're probably eating them and breathing them every day. They're so tiny. Things that you can do to help prevent that, buy natural fiber clothing. You can also buy filters for your washing machine, but if you can find a way to get the natural fiber clothing, that's even better. We have some other solutions for plastics in our ocean. We want to eliminate the single-use plastic problem. So when we're thinking about saving the Earth for Earth Week, we want to reduce the amount of waste that we create. We want to reuse plastic containers or glass if we're able to, and then we want to recycle things that cannot be reused.
Absolutely. So we've got a few examples of things that you might switch from. So maybe you have those plastic Ziploc bags at home. Maybe you put sandwiches or food in them. A nice alternative is something like this. This is actually made out of paper instead. These have little sharks on it, so sometimes I pack my kids' sandwiches in these at home.
Right. So those are still single use. Those are still convenient and sanitary, but they'll biodegrade, won't they?
That's right. So that's the difference.
They'll break down.
So if you are a fan of Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks and you like to have that morning coffee, instead of getting a cup that comes from a place like that, you may consider something like this, something that's reusable. And same thing, we've got our water bottles here, mine and Debbie's as well. Again, we'll give a shout out to protecting our wildlife and reducing single-use plastics. Hopefully some of our CRC students recognize those stickers. All right, and some other alternatives that we have here. If you're going to be getting one of those beverages and maybe an iced tea, for example, doesn't mean that you have to skip it all together, but maybe you refuse that straw and use one of your own. So we have a couple of examples here, and then in the box are actually some compostable straws. I have kids at home, and believe me, they like to use a straw. So we use the compostable ones and we use the metal ones at home as well. We have some other alternatives if you are a fan of seltzer, right? You might use something like a soda stream at home, so you're reducing that waste. That's another great alternative. And then we've got, of course, just an easy fix. If you use paper napkins at home or paper towels, you might consider using something that's reusable. Some other alternatives. There is a beeswax wrap.
that allows us to replace plastic wrap. So if you need to keep some veggies fresh, this is coated in beeswax. It's a piece of canvas, and it is washable and reusable. So you can store your produce in that. Some alternatives to Ziploc bags as well. Travel with your cutlery, or if you're going to get takeout, you can ask ahead if you can reuse plastic containers, or if you're in a restaurant and you're going to take your leftovers home. Now, I know there's a teacher from Ellington I wanted to acknowledge, and all of her students. Thank you for posting. She was the first one on our feed this morning. She also said that some people are unable to use their reusable materials right now because of COVID-19 and to limit the spread. However, we like to remind everyone that the virus is easily killed with hot water and soap. So there are some businesses that are refusing to fill your reusable mugs, but there are still some that are willing to do that. So you can make choices about who you want to patronize at this time.
Yeah.
So another thing, Connecticut has done a really great job at reducing the number of plastic bags that are being used every year. Unfortunately, we have had a little setback with our coronavirus crisis, but most places will allow you to use these bags if you bag your groceries yourself and you wash them very carefully when you get home with soap and water or a disinfectant as well. So we can continue to protect our environment in spite of our global pandemic.
All right, so my favorite piece is probably this recycle piece. Now everyone's used to that, wastebasket or your recycling bin at home, but I have a couple ideas that you might want to try if you have kids like I do. And so I'll start off with these yogurt jars. They're one of my favorites. And so once you are done with the yogurt, they actually make these lids so you can put them right on top and put other things inside here. My son has been using these to keep track of his schoolwork at home, like what he's been working on and what's already been done. So we just slide the popsicle sticks in one to the other. So that helps us keep track of schoolwork at home. Paper towel tubes or toilet paper rolls are a really fun thing to reuse. This is a squid, in case you couldn't tell at home, so that's a good project. You can make things like sea anemones or other sorts of creatures with them as well. And then if we think about something like an egg carton, that's another great one that you can make into a craft. Here's a little hermit crab that my son made, so that's a pretty cute one. But if you keep them intact, it's another great thing. You can work on sorting activities. You might do sorting by color, or take this out in the field and you can do a scavenger hunt at home. And then I'll show you one more. Everyone's receiving lots of boxes probably with things getting shipped at home. So we had some bubble wrap in ours. We were dipping that in paint, and then we were able to make this cool kind of blooming tree to represent spring here.
Nice.
All right.
Oh, another Ellington teacher watching.
Awesome. And the last thing I wanted to show, everyone recognizes something like this, right? So if you are ending up with plastic waste like this, it's always great to just take a pair of scissors, and before you toss this in the recycling bin, just to snip all of those circles. We were talking about entanglement of animals earlier, and so that's a great thing to do to help reduce that.
So for Earth Week, we're going to sign off, but we do encourage you to use the CleanSwell app this week and clean up somewhere in your watershed. Find somewhere, it could even be your street or even just your front yard. Only clean with people and the members of your household. But spend 15-20 minutes outside, pick up some trash. Even send us a picture of the weird stuff you might find. You'd be surprised what we find in our watershed. And just help us clean up Long Island Sound's watershed this week.
Excellent. And you can send all of those things with the hashtag cleanup at Project O. Is that correct, Debbie? Did I get it right?
Yeah, the email address, if you want to send us an email at cleanup@oceanology.org, or our hashtag is hashtag Project O Cleanup.
Oh, I got it reversed. Thanks for helping me.
Hashtag Project O Cleanup. Yeah, send us all those pictures. We'd love to see what you're doing out there.
Okay. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.